My daughter-in-law booked a $19,000 vacation with my card. Then asked me to babysit. I found out on a Tuesday morning, sitting at my own kitchen table with my reading glasses on and my coffee going cold, staring at a number on my bank statement that made no sense at all, until 3 days later it made perfect, infuriating sense. But before I tell you what happened next, and trust me, you are going to want to hear every single word of this, I want to know who's sitting with me tonight. Tell me where you're watching from, put your city in the comments. I read every one of them, I really do. It makes an old woman feel a little less alone telling a story like this. And if you love your grandmother, if you believe family should mean honesty first and comfort second, do me a favor and hit that like button, subscribe, and share this with somebody who needs to hear it tonight. Now let me tell you what Brittany did to me, and what I did back. My name is Eleanor Hartman. I am 68 years old. I live alone in a house in Cedar Falls, Iowa that my late husband Robert and I bought 41 years ago, and I have exactly one son, Daniel, and exactly one daughter-in-law, Brittany, and 2 grandchildren, Ava, who is 7, and Mason, who just turned 4. I worked 31 years as a bookkeeper for a family-owned hardware store here in town, and I want you to remember that fact, because it is going to matter a great deal for what comes next. When Robert passed 4 years ago, he left me the house free and clear, a modest pension, and enough savings that I don't have to worry, as long as I stay careful. I have never been rich, but I have always been exact. 2 years ago, when Daniel and Brittany were going through a tight stretch after Mason was born, I did something I had never done for anyone outside my own husband and son. I added Brittany as an authorized user on one of my credit cards, a secondary one with a $15,000 limit, the card I kept strictly for emergencies. I sat her down right at this kitchen table and told her plainly, this is for the children, for a formula, for a car repair, for something urgent you can't reach me about. Use it if you truly need to, and just let me know afterwards so I can keep my books straight. For 2 years, she used it maybe 4 or 5 times, always small, always followed within the hour by a text and a photo of the receipt. A car seat. An emergency room copay when Mason swallowed something he shouldn't have. Winter boots for Ava. I used to brag about her to my friends at church, told them how lucky I was, how responsible she was. I want you to hold on to that, because it matters for what I found later. I should tell you a little more about how Brittany and I got to that place of trust, because it didn't happen overnight, and it wasn't nothing. When Daniel first brought her home, 9 years ago now, she was 24, working at a dental office in Waterloo, and I'll admit I watched her. The way most mothers watch the woman their son brings to Sunday dinner, quietly, carefully, looking for the cracks. I didn't find many. She helped me clear the table without being asked. She remembered that I took my coffee black, no sugar, after only being told once. She sat on the porch with me the summer evening Daniel proposed and cried real tears, not performance tears, when she told me she'd always wanted a mother-in-law like me, because her own mother had passed when she was 19 and she'd been aching for that kind of steady, older presence in her life ever since. I believed her. I still believe that part of her was genuine, even now, even after everything. When Ava was born, I drove to their apartment every single day for the first 6 weeks, not because they asked me to, but because I remembered what those first 6 weeks felt like with Daniel, the exhaustion that sits in your bones, the way even making a sandwich feels like too much. I did their laundry. I held that baby so Brittany could shower for the first time in 4 days. When Mason came along 3 years later, it was the same, maybe even more, because by then Ava was a toddler underfoot and Daniel had just taken on a second job driving for a delivery service to help cover the gap while Brittany was on unpaid leave. Those were hard years for them financially, genuinely hard, and I want to be fair when I say that. I never once resented giving them that card. I offered it freely, out of love, because that is what a mother does, and because Robert, God rest him, always used to say that money sitting in an account doing nothing while your family struggles is money wasted, no matter how big the number looks on a statement. So when I tell you I trusted her, I need you to understand it wasn't a naive trust. It was a trust built over 9 years of Sunday dinners and shared holidays and the two of us standing shoulder to shoulder at the stove more times than I could count, her asking me how Robert liked his pie crust, me teaching her the trick with the vinegar that my own mother taught me. That is the trust that was sitting on the table the Tuesday morning I found that charge. Not blind trust. Earned trust, or so I thought, which made the betrayal cut so much deeper than it would have from a stranger, or even from an acquaintance I'd never fully let in. 3 weeks ago, on that same Tuesday morning, going through my statements line by line the way 31 years of bookkeeping trains you to do without fail, I found a single charge, dated 11 days earlier, for $19,240, to a company called Azure Horizon Travel Group. I sat there a long time just staring at it, the way you stare at a number hoping it will rearrange itself into something smaller. My first instinct was fraud, some stranger with my card number. I called the bank to ask about the merchant, and the woman on the line read me the details. A boutique agency specializing in all-inclusive luxury villa packages in Turks and Caicos. On my emergency card. $19,240. I did not call Brittany screaming. That has never been who I am. I grew up in a house where you sat very still and figured out exactly what you were going to say before you said it, because once it was said, you couldn't take it back. So I decided to wait, and watch, and see whether she would come to me with the truth before I ever had to ask for it. 3 days went by. Not a word. She dropped the kids off Thursday, hugged me at the door like always, let Ava show me a drawing, never once mentioned a $19,000 charge on a card meant for diapers and emergency rooms. Then, Saturday morning, she called, bright and giddy, the way people sound when they're about to ask for something big. Daniel and I are finally taking that trip we've been talking about, she said. We found this incredible villa deal in Turks and Caicos, 10 days, right on the beach. We haven't had a real vacation since before Mason was born. And then, the real reason for the call. We leave in 2.5 weeks, and I know it's a huge ask, but could you take the kids the whole 10 days? You're so good with them, there's nobody else we'd trust like this. Daniel already said he owes you one. He owes me one, for watching my own grandchildren, using money that had already quietly left my own account to pay for the trip he was thanking me in advance for. I told her I needed to check my calendar. That was a lie, my calendar is never too full for those babies, but I needed time, and I hung up and sat at that same table where I'd found the charge and made a decision. I am not proud of the way you're proud of something kind, but proud of the way you're proud of finally standing up straight. I was going to say yes to the babysitting. I was going to smile and hug her and tell her to have a wonderful time. And I was going to spend every day between now and their flight, and every single day they were gone, building something. Money leaves a trail. Every time. Once I knew where to look, I stopped looking at just that one charge and pulled the full 2-year history on that card, every itemized transaction, and sat at my table with a yellow highlighter the way I used to reconcile the hardware store's books when something didn't add up. The handful of honest emergency charges were exactly what she'd said they were. But scattered between them over 18 months were things she had never once mentioned. $600 at a spa in Des Moines. $320 at a boutique I'd never heard of. An $89 monthly beauty subscription box. $400 at a furniture consignment shop. None of it emergencies. None of it ever came with a text or a receipt. Altogether, before the vacation, just over $4,300 of my money, spent quietly on herself. I felt something in my chest I hadn't felt since Robert died. Not the kind of anger that makes you cry. The kind that makes you very, very calm. I want to walk you through exactly how I found each one of those charges, because I think the method matters almost as much as the discovery itself. I laid all 40 pages out across my kitchen table in date order, and I went back to the very first month Brittany had access to that card, and I read every single line item the way I used to read the hardware store's monthly reconciliation, out loud, under my breath, cross-referencing each merchant code against anything I could remember her mentioning to me at the time. The spa charge in Des Moines, I remembered, had landed the same week Brittany told me she'd had a rough week with Mason teething and needed, in her words, a little self-care. I remembered nodding sympathetically at the time, telling her every mother deserves that. I did not know, sitting across from her at this very table eating banana bread, that the self-care in question had come directly out of my emergency fund. The furniture consignment charge, $400, I traced to a weekend Daniel had mentioned, almost in passing, that Brittany had found a great deal on a little accent chair for the nursery. A great deal. I sat there thinking about how many times over those 18 months I had heard some small, cheerful mention of a good find, a lucky deal, a treat she deserved, never once connecting any of it to my card, because why would I? I trusted her enough not to go looking, and she knew that, and I believe now, looking back with clear eyes, that she counted on exactly that. I called my oldest friend, Carol Whitfield, that same evening, mostly because I needed to say the numbers out loud to another human being before I did anything else with them. Carol and I have known each other since we were 19 years old, working the same shift at a diner that doesn't even exist anymore, and she is the only person besides Harold I trust with something this raw before I've decided what to do with it. I read her the list over the phone, every highlighted line, and when I got to the $19,240 charge, she went completely silent for a moment and then said, "Eleanor, honey, you tell me right now you are not about to just eat this and smile through Thanksgiving." I told her I had no intention of eating anything, that I was building a plan, and she said, "Good, because if you'd called me telling me you were going to let this slide to keep the peace, I was going to drive over there myself and slide it right back." Carol has known Brittany almost as long as I have, has hosted her at her own holiday table more times than either of us could count, and I think it hurt Carol almost as much as it hurt me, hearing that number out loud. She asked me the same question Harold would ask me the next morning, though she asked it more bluntly. The way only a friend of 50 years can. She said, "Do you want to save this marriage or do you want to burn it down? Because you need to know the answer before you make a single move, or you'll end up doing both halfway and getting neither." I told her I honestly didn't know yet, and she said that was fair, that grief and betrayal don't hand you clarity on a schedule, sometimes you have to move forward and let the clarity catch up to you. Before I was a bookkeeper, I spent 6 years doing books and filing for a small law office in town, and I picked up more than accounting in those years. I picked up a lawyer, an old family friend named Harold Voss, retired now, but still taking calls from people he likes, and I am one of the people he likes. I called him that afternoon and told him everything. He asked me one question. "Eleanor, what do you actually want here, your money back, to punish her, or for your son to understand what kind of marriage he's actually in?" I told him all three, and I wanted her to feel, once, exactly what I'd felt at this table, blindsided and small. He told me that was doable, legal, and told me exactly how to be smart about it. Harold spent almost 2 hours with me that afternoon, first on the phone and then, once he heard how serious this was, in person at his kitchen table with a legal pad, the way we used to sit together decades ago going over the law office's books. He explained that because Brittany had been added as an authorized user rather than a joint account holder, the legal responsibility for every charge on that card, in the eyes of the credit card company, sat with me alone, which meant I had every right to dispute charges I hadn't personally authorized, regardless of what family arrangement had existed around the card informally. He also explained, and this is the part that surprised me most, that because I had given her explicit, limited permission for emergency use only, and could document that limitation through our text message history where I'd originally laid out the terms, any charge outside that scope could potentially be treated, legally, as unauthorized use of a financial instrument, which in a case this size, could rise to the level of a criminal matter if I chose to pursue it that way. I asked him directly whether he thought I should go that route, press charges, involve the police, make it official and permanent and impossible to walk back. Harold, who has known my family for over 30 years, who held Daniel as a baby at his own daughter's baptism, told me something I have thought about every day since. He said, "Eleanor, the law can give you justice, but it cannot give you your family back the way it was, and you need to decide which one you actually want more, because you're not going to get to have both at their fullest." He told me that in his 40 years of practicing law, he had seen plenty of people win their case and lose everything else in the process, and he had also seen people who were so afraid of losing everything else that they let themselves get run over again and again by the same person, because at least being run over was familiar. We spent a long time that afternoon mapping out what Harold called the middle path, a plan that would give me full legal leverage, real teeth, real consequences, while leaving me the choice, at every single stage, of how far to actually take it. He drafted, right there at his table, a simple letter I could have Brittany and Daniel sign together, a repayment agreement with specific terms and dates, The kind of document that meant nothing had to go through a courtroom unless she failed to honor it, at which point I would have every piece of documentation I needed to pursue it fully. He told me, and I remember this clearly because it settled something in my chest that had been unsettled for days, that having the power to destroy something and choosing not to use all of it is not weakness, it is the highest form of control a person can have. For the next 2.5 weeks, while Brittany believed I was simply preparing to babysit, I did 3 things quietly. First, I called the bank and removed her as an authorized user on that card, effective the day after their flight, not before, because I wanted the booking locked in, non-refundable, first. Second, I called Azure Horizon Travel Group myself, identified myself honestly as the cardholder, and asked about their dispute policy. Non-refundable within 30 days, but any refund on a disputed unauthorized charge would go to the original cardholder. Me. I did not cancel the trip. I let it happen. I simply made sure every dollar tied to it was, legally and financially, mine to reclaim. I want to tell you about that phone call to the bank in a little more detail, because it took 3 separate conversations to actually get it arranged the way I needed. The first representative I spoke with told me removing an authorized user takes effect immediately upon request, which was not what I wanted, so I asked to speak with a supervisor and explained, honestly, that I needed the change scheduled for a specific future date due to a family travel situation. The supervisor, a patient man named Terrence who I ended up speaking with twice more over those 2 weeks, was able to schedule the removal for the exact date I needed, the day after their flight was set to depart, and he also walked me through the fraud dispute process in detail, explaining that once I filed the dispute, the card issuer would likely place a temporary hold on related transactions while they investigated, which meant not just future charges but potentially the original hold-on. Incidentals tied to that hotel and travel booking. I remember writing all of this down on my yellow legal pad, the same one I used to use for hardware store inventory counts, because I wanted every step documented, every date confirmed, in case Harold needed it later. The call to Azure Horizon Travel Group was harder for me emotionally than the call to the bank, I'll admit that. A cheerful young woman answered, and when I explained I was calling about a $19,240 villa package booked under my card, she assumed, understandably, that I was calling with a question about my upcoming trip, and asked me, brightly, if I was looking forward to Turks and Caicos. I had to sit with that question for a second longer than I'd like to admit, because the honest answer was that I had never once been asked if I wanted to go. My money had simply been spent as though my wants didn't factor into the equation at all. I told her, evenly, that I was the cardholder but not the traveler, and that I had some questions about dispute procedures should it become necessary. She transferred me to their billing department, where I learned the details Harold and I had anticipated, and I hung up that call and sat very still in my kitchen for a long while, letting myself feel, fully, just how strange it is to fund a vacation for 2 people who never once thought to ask if you'd like to come, or even if you'd like to be told about it at all. Third, I called my son. I invited Daniel over alone, on a day Brittany had a hair appointment, laid the 40 highlighted pages on my table, and said, I need you to look at something and tell me if you knew. I watched the color drain from his face as he read, especially at the bottom, at the $19,000 line. He said, Mom, I swear I didn't know any of this. I believed him, because I know exactly what my son's face looks like when he's lying to protect someone, and this was not that. I did not tell him about the dispute I planned to file, or the card that would freeze the moment they landed. I told him only that I loved him and those children more than anything, and I would still watch them for 10 days without complaint, because babies don't deserve to be punished for their parents' foolishness. But I told him plainly that after this trip, some things were going to change, and I hoped he'd think hard about what kind of partnership he wanted his marriage to be. He left quieter than I'd seen him in years, and Brittany never knew that conversation happened. The morning of the flight, Brittany dropped the kids off glowing, in a sundress I'd never seen and did not want to know the price of, hugged me, said this means the world to us, we'll call every day. I hugged her back just as tight and told her to have the time of her life. I meant that more than she understood. Those 10 days with Ava and Mason were some of the sweetest I've had in years, and I want to tell you about a few of them properly, because they mattered to me every bit as much as the rest of this story, maybe more. On the first full day, a Sunday, I took them to the little Baptist church 2 streets over, not our usual church, but one with a children's program Ava had been asking about since. A friend from school invited her to a vacation Bible school there last summer. Mason fell asleep during the sermon with his head on my shoulder, drooling straight through the shoulder of my good blue cardigan, and I did not move an inch for 40 minutes rather than wake him. Afterward, we got ice cream, and Ava told me, very seriously, over a scoop of mint chocolate chip, that she thought she wanted to be a veterinarian when she grew up, or possibly a baker. She hadn't fully decided, and could we please get a hamster sometime, not necessarily right now, but sometime. I told her sometime was a very reasonable word to use, and she seemed satisfied with that answer for the time being. On the third day, the day the crisis call would come later that afternoon, we spent the morning baking cookies, the same oatmeal recipe Robert used to request every single week of our marriage, and Mason insisted on cracking the eggs himself, which meant I picked approximately 1/3 of an eggshell out of the batter with a spoon while pretending not to notice him watching me anxiously to see if I'd be upset. I was not upset. I have never once in my life been upset about an eggshell in cookie batter, though I have learned that a 4-year-old needs to see you handle that kind of small mistake with grace, because it teaches them, more than any lecture ever could, that mistakes are survivable and love doesn't disappear over spilled things. On the 5th day, Ava had a rough afternoon, missing her parents in the particular sharp way that 7-year-olds sometimes do, out of nowhere, in the middle of an otherwise ordinary Tuesday, and she cried at the kitchen table and asked me why Mommy and Daddy got to go somewhere fun without her. I did not answer that question with anything close to the truth I was carrying. I told her that grown-ups sometimes need a little time together to remember how much they love each other, the way she and her best friend Maddie sometimes needed a sleepover just the two of them, and that it didn't mean anything was wrong, it just meant love needs different kinds of time sometimes. She thought about that for a while, wiped her nose on her sleeve despite the napkin sitting right in front of her, and asked if we could make a card for them to open when they got home. We spent the rest of that afternoon making 2 cards, one from each of them. Mason's mostly scribbles with a very determined-looking blue dinosaur in the corner, Ava's an elaborate drawing of the whole family standing in front of a rainbow, and I kept both of those cards, unfinished business at the time, because I did not yet know what kind of homecoming their parents were going to have. Mason wore his dinosaur rain boots even when it wasn't raining, and I let him, because some hills aren't worth dying on. Ava beat me at a card game most evenings, and I let her believe I wasn't letting her win, even on the nights I actually wasn't. Nothing that was coming for their parents was ever going to touch those children. That was a line I drew from the beginning and never crossed, no matter what else was unfolding 4,000 miles away. On day 3, while the kids napped, I got the call I'd been waiting for. Daniel, his voice tight, said Brittany's card had been declined at the resort restaurant. His own was nearly maxed from flights and the deposit. Could I check if there was some fraud alert on my account? They were kind of stuck. I sat on my back porch watching the kids' chalk drawings fade in the sun and said, "Oh no, that's strange, let me look into it, I'll call you right back." I let 3 hours pass. 3 hours in a resort in Turks and Caicos with 2 adults who had no way to pay for dinner, no way to pay for the next morning's excursion, and a bar tab Brittany had assumed would simply go on a room now tied to a frozen, disputed card. I spent part of those 3 hours sitting on my back porch with a glass of iced tea, watching the kids draw with chalk on the driveway, and I will not pretend my stomach wasn't in knots the entire time, because some part of me, the part that raised Daniel and rocked him through every fever and every heartbreak, hated knowing my son was standing in a resort lobby somewhere feeling embarrassed and confused. But I kept reminding myself of something Harold had said to me at his kitchen table, that sometimes the kindest thing you can do for your child is let them stand in the consequences of a marriage they chose, so they can see it clearly for themselves instead of you smoothing it over one more time. When I finally called back, Daniel picked up on the first ring, and I could hear the resort's restaurant noise behind him, silverware and other people's laughter, the kind of ordinary vacation sounds that must have felt like they were mocking him in that moment. I told him, with what I hope came across as genuine confusion, that the bank mentioned a dispute filed on that large charge and it might take a few days. Maybe they should use their own savings in the meantime, since after all, it was their vacation. There was a pause, and then I heard him relay this to Brittany, and then I heard her voice, not muffled enough, rising sharply, asking why on earth Eleanor's card would have a dispute filed on the exact charge that paid for their villa. and didn't Eleanor know that would cause a problem, and could someone please just call the bank and fix it because they had a boat excursion booked for 8 in the morning that they'd already paid a deposit on. I heard Daniel say, "Mom, hold on," and then a scraping sound like he'd stepped away from the table, and his voice got quieter, more private, when he came back on the line. He asked me directly, "Mom, is there something going on with the card that you're not telling me?" I sat on my porch and made a choice in that moment that I still think about. I could have told him everything right then, over the phone, for 1,000 miles away, with Brittany close enough to overhear. But I had decided, and Harold had agreed, that this conversation deserved to happen face to face, on solid ground, not shouted across an ocean while everyone involved was stressed, jet-lagged, and financially cornered. So I told my son, honestly but incompletely, that there were some things about that card I needed to discuss with him and Brittany together, in person, once they were home, and that I was sorry he was dealing with an inconvenience on his vacation, but that everything would be explained properly and soon. I could hear him breathing on the other end, the particular quality of breath a person has when they know they're not getting the whole story and are deciding whether to push. He didn't push. He said, "Okay, Mom, we'll figure it out," and he told me he loved me, and I told him I loved him too, more than he knew, and we hung up. I later learned from Daniel, once they were home and everything had come out, that the rest of that evening had been miserable for both of them. They'd had to explain to the boat excursion company that they needed to cancel or find another payment method, losing the deposit entirely. They'd eaten a quiet, tense dinner at the resort's least expensive restaurant option, paid for with the last available room on Daniel's own card, and Brittany had apparently spent a good portion of that dinner insisting, over and over, that there had to be some mistake, some bank error, refusing even then to consider that the dispute might have anything to do with how the trip had been paid for in the first place. Daniel told me later that something about her insistence, her refusal to even entertain the possibility that this was connected to something she'd done, was the first moment he started to genuinely wonder what he didn't know. I will not pretend that phone call didn't bring me satisfaction. Not because I enjoyed my son's struggle, that part genuinely weighed on me, but because for the first time, Brittany was feeling exactly what I'd felt 3 weeks earlier at this table. Helpless. Blindsided. Small. The rest of the trip, Daniel later told me, they had to pull money from their joint savings, the fund they'd been building toward a bigger house, just to cover meals and deposits already committed. Brittany had to watch, in real time, a piece of their actual future disappear to pay for a vacation she'd secretly funded with someone else's money. I did not orchestrate that particular consequence. Life handed her that one entirely on its own, and I did not shed a single tear over it. Daniel told me, in the weeks that followed, that the last 4 days of the trip were quiet in a way that had nothing to do with relaxation. He said Brittany kept insisting she wanted to call the bank herself and sort it out, but every attempt hit the same wall. They weren't the primary cardholder, no information could be released to them, please have Eleanor Hartman contact us directly. He said he watched his wife grow more and more agitated over those 4 days, not sad exactly, more frustrated, the way a person gets frustrated when a plan that used to work smoothly suddenly stops cooperating, and he told me it was somewhere around day 7, lying awake in that villa bed unable to sleep, that he started running numbers in his head, trying to remember exactly how they'd afforded a trip like this in the first place, and realizing he genuinely could not remember Brittany ever explaining where the money had come from beyond a vague mention of a good deal she'd found. They came home on a Thursday evening, and I want to tell you about picking the kids up that day, because it stuck with me. Daniel arrived at my door looking like a man who had aged 5 years and 10 days, not from sunburn or exhaustion, but from something heavier sitting behind his eyes. He hugged me longer than usual at the door, and when I asked, quietly, how the trip had been, he just said, "Mom, we need to talk soon," and I said, "I know," and left it there, because that was not the night for it, not with Ava and Mason bouncing around us excited to show their parents the 2 homemade cards and tell them every detail of 10 days' worth of adventures. I did not confront Brittany that night. I let them get home, get settled, get the kids to bed in their own house, breathe for a day. But I want to be honest, that day of waiting was hard for me too. I sat in my kitchen that Friday evening with Carol on the phone again, and she asked me how I was holding up, and I told her the truth, that some part of me wanted to march straight over there and get it over with, But the bigger part of me knew that rushed anger rarely produces the outcome you actually want. It just produces relief for about 10 minutes and then regret for considerably longer. Carol reminded me of something her own mother used to say, that the best revenge is a well-documented one, and we both laughed for the first time in what felt like weeks, because it was exactly the kind of dry, practical thing an old Iowa farm woman would say, and it was exactly what I needed to hear. 2 days later, I called and asked if Brittany would come over alone, just the two of us, no kids, no Daniel, because I wanted to talk about something important. There was a pause on the line before she said yes, and I could hear something in that pause, a kind of dread, like some part of her already suspected what this conversation was going to be about, even if she hadn't let herself fully think it through yet. She came Saturday afternoon, looking tired in a way that had nothing to do with jet lag. I made tea, sat her at this same table, laid the 40 highlighted pages in front of her, the same pages I'd shown Daniel, and said, I need you to look through these and tell me the truth about every highlighted line, because I already know the answer, I just want to see if you'll lie to my face. She cried. She did not try to talk her way out with excuses about deserving a vacation or how hard motherhood had been. She looked at the pages, looked at me, and said, I don't even know how to explain it, except it started small and it just kept feeling easier to keep going than to stop and admit what I'd already done. I want to walk you through more of that conversation, because it lasted almost 3 hours, and I think the shape of it matters. I asked her, first, to start from the very beginning, the spa charge from 18 months ago, the first one on the list that wasn't an approved emergency, and tell me honestly what was going through her mind that day. She sat with her tea going cold in front of her, the same way mine had gone cold weeks earlier at this same table, and told me that Mason had been going through a brutal teething stretch, waking every 90 minutes for what felt like 2 straight weeks, and she'd hit a wall of exhaustion she didn't know how to climb out of, and one afternoon, scrolling on her phone during his nap, an ad for a Mother's Day spa package had come up, and she told herself it would just be this once, she'd pay me back somehow, she just needed one afternoon to feel human again. I asked her why, if that was the honest reason, she hadn't simply called me and asked. I would have said yes. I would have driven over and watched those babies myself so she could have that afternoon guilt-free. She looked down at her hands and said, I think I was embarrassed to ask, and once I didn't ask, it felt easier to just use the card and not mention it than to explain why I hadn't asked in the first place. And once I'd done it once without you noticing, it stopped feeling like a big decision every time after that. I asked her about the furniture, the clothing, the beauty subscription box, and each answer had a similar shape, some real stressor, some real exhaustion, and underneath all of it, a pattern of choosing the quiet, easy, unspoken solution instead of the harder, honest conversation. I told her I understood exhaustion. I told her I had raised Daniel through colic and 2 broken arms and one truly terrifying bout of pneumonia when he was 5, largely on my own some weeks because Robert traveled for work, and I never once solved my exhaustion by quietly spending someone else's money and hoping they wouldn't notice. I told her that everyone gets tired, everyone gets overwhelmed, and the difference between an overwhelmed person and a dishonest one isn't the tiredness, it's what you do with it when nobody's watching. Then I asked her the question that mattered most to me, the one I'd been sitting with since that first Tuesday morning. Did you ever, for 1 second, think about what $19,000 means to a woman my age, on a fixed income, before you booked a villa with it? She was quiet for a long moment, longer than any silence before it in that conversation, and then she said, honestly, Eleanor, I don't think I did. Not really, not in the way I should have. She said the credit limit had always just felt like this abstract number sitting there, available, and somewhere in her mind she'd stopped connecting it to an actual person with an actual retirement to protect, and the moment she said that out loud, sitting at my table, I watched something shift in her own face, like she was hearing the sentence for the first time herself and finding it as ugly as I did. I told her the 4,300 in small purchases hurt almost more than the vacation, because the vacation was one moment of terrible judgment, but the small charges were a pattern, dozens of choices, each one making the next easier, a habit she had built slowly and deliberately over a year and a half, never once interrupted by conscience, only ever interrupted by getting caught. She asked me, at one point, her voice small, whether I was going to tell her father, who lives 2 states away and who she has always described as a quiet, disappointed sort of man, not cruel, just permanently unimpressed. I told her that was not my call to make, that was hers, but I told her I thought a woman who wanted to actually change, rather than simply survive getting caught, usually had to be willing to let the people who loved her see the whole truth, even the parts that made her flinch. Here is where I made a decision I want to explain, because I know some of you are expecting me to say I cut her off entirely, cut Daniel off, rewrote my will, never spoke to her again. That is not what I did, and I want to tell you why, and I want to take a moment on this part, because I think it's the part that actually matters most in this whole story. I sat with Brittany's admission for a long moment before I said anything about consequences, and in that silence, I thought about my own mother, who used to say that anger is a fire that will burn the thing you pointed at, but it doesn't know the difference between the thing you meant to burn and everything standing next to it. I thought about Ava's drawing of the whole family in front of a rainbow, sitting folded in my kitchen drawer, waiting for parents who almost came home to a very different kind of reckoning. I thought about Robert, and what he would have said, because Robert was a forgiving man in a way I have always admired and occasionally resented, a man who believed that people could change if you gave them a real reason to, paired with a real consequence, rather than either one alone. I told Brittany I was not filing criminal charges, though Harold confirmed I legally could have and would very likely have one, given the paper trail, the documented terms of the card's use, and the sheer scale of the vacation charge alone. I told her I had, in fact, spent an entire evening at Harold's kitchen table going through exactly what that process would look like, the police report, the potential for felony theft charges given the dollar amount involved in Iowa, the court dates, the possibility, however small, of an actual criminal record that would follow her for the rest of her life, show up on background checks, potentially affect her ability to get certain jobs, certainly affect how every single person in this town looked at her from that point forward. I let her sit with the reality that this had been a genuine option on the table, not a bluff, not a scare tactic, an actual choice I had seriously weighed with my lawyer. Then I told her why I chose not to. Ava and Mason did not deserve to watch their mother face legal consequences or their parents' marriage collapse under that weight, just to satisfy the part of me that wanted her to suffer as much as I had. I told her something else too, something I hadn't fully articulated even to myself until that exact moment, sitting across from her with cold tea between us. I told her that punishing her into the ground wouldn't actually give me back what I'd lost, which wasn't money, not really, the money came back through the dispute regardless. What I'd lost was the simple, easy trust of believing my daughter-in-law was who she said she was, and destroying her wasn't going to return that to me either. The only thing that had any chance of returning it, even partially, even slowly, was watching her actually become someone trustworthy again, which meant she needed to still be standing, still be in this family, still have something to lose by disappointing me twice. But I informed her, I did not ask her, exactly what was going to happen instead. The $4,300 in personal charges would be repaid to me in full, on a schedule she and Daniel worked out together and brought to me in writing. The $19,240 dispute would stand, and if the bank ruled in my favor, that money would come back to me, and I alone would decide whether it went toward the grandchildren's college funds or stayed exactly where it belonged. She was permanently removed as an authorized user, no exceptions. And if a genuine emergency involving the children ever arose again, she could call me directly and I would handle it myself. And I told her the thing that landed hardest, harder than any of the money. For 2 years I had bragged about her to my friends, told everyone how lucky my son was to have married someone so responsible, and what hurt worse than $19,000 was realizing I'd been telling people something that wasn't true, and having to sit with the fact that I didn't actually know the person I'd been bragging about. She cried harder at that than at anything else. It has been 3 weeks since that conversation. The bank ruled in my favor. All $19,240 came back to my account, and I've already spoken to Harold about setting up education trust accounts for Ava and Mason with a good portion of it, because whatever their mother did, those children did nothing wrong. And I refuse to let this touch their future. I put $8,000 into each of their accounts, locked until they turn 18, and I kept the remainder for myself, because frankly, after everything, I decided I had earned a little peace of mind, and I used part of it to finally replace the roof on this house, something I'd been putting off for 2 years, telling myself it could wait one more winter. Robert would have laughed at that, I think, the idea that Brittany's worst decision ended up paying for my new roof. There's a kind of justice in that I didn't plan but don't mind one bit. Brittany and Daniel started financial counseling alongside marriage counseling they'd quietly already begun months earlier, for reasons that, it turns out, ran deeper than my credit card. Daniel told me, in a long conversation we had over coffee about a week after everything came out, that he and Brittany had actually started seeing a counselor back in the spring because of what he described as a growing distance between them, a sense that they were co-managing a household rather than actually living a life together. And that money had already been a quiet source of tension before I ever found that Azure Horizon travel group charge. He said learning about the card made him go back and look at their joint accounts with fresh eyes, and he found other things too, smaller things. Decisions Brittany had made about their own shared money without fully looping him in, nothing illegal, nothing that involved anyone else's card, just a pattern of quiet, independent financial choices that had been eroding the partnership between them for longer than either of them had wanted to admit out loud. I want to tell you about the day I found out the full extent of what those counseling sessions uncovered, because it changed how I understood this whole situation. Daniel told me that in one session, the counselor had asked Brittany directly why she hadn't simply talked to either of them, to him or to me, about how overwhelmed she'd been feeling those first 2 years after Mason was born, instead of solving it quietly through spending she hid. Brittany had apparently broken down in that session and admitted something she'd never said to anyone before, that she'd grown up in a household where money was a constant, screaming, door-slamming source of conflict between her own parents before her mother passed, and she had built, without ever consciously deciding to, a deep fear of bringing financial stress into conversations with people she loved. So instead she solved problems silently and hoped nobody would ever have to know there had been a problem at all. It didn't excuse what she did, and I told Daniel as much, and he agreed completely, but it helped explain the shape of it, the why underneath the what, and understanding the why is often the only real path toward a person actually changing rather than just feeling sorry for a while and drifting back into old patterns. Once the heat dies down. Brittany has repaid nearly half of the $4,300 already, from her own part-time income, not joint money, exactly as I specified, without complaint. She picked up extra shifts at the dental office where she still works part-time, and Daniel told me she has turned down 2 separate girls' weekend invitations from her college friends in the last month alone, telling them plainly that she was working on paying back a debt and couldn't justify the spending right now, which I found out about secondhand and which meant more to me than almost anything else in this entire process, because it told me she was willing to be honest about her mistake even to people outside our family, not just performing contrition for me and Daniel while quietly protecting her image everywhere else. She hasn't asked to be added back to any card. She hasn't tried to buy her way back into my good graces with gestures. She texts me every week with a photo of the kids and a small honest line, "Thank you for still trusting me with them," or "I know I have a long way to go." And it feels real in a way that giddy phone call about Turks and Caicos never did. 2 weeks ago, she showed up at my door unannounced, without the kids, just her, holding a single potted African violet, my favorite flower, the kind Robert used to bring me every anniversary. She didn't say much, just handed it to me and said, "I know a plant doesn't fix anything, I just wanted you to have something that wasn't about money for once, something that was just because I was thinking of you." I put it on my kitchen windowsill, right next to Mason's little paper cups of seeds, and I have to admit, every time I water it, I think about how strange it is that the smallest gestures sometimes carry more weight than the largest apologies ever could. Do I fully trust her again? No. Not yet. Trust isn't handed back just because someone repays you with interest and says the right things in a counseling office. It's rebuilt slowly, the same patient way I built this whole plan, one honest step at a time, watching whether actions match words, for as long as it takes. I have started thinking about trust the way I used to think about bookkeeping, actually, which I know sounds cold coming from a grandmother talking about her own family, but bear with me. In accounting, you don't trust a number because someone tells you it's right. You trust it because you've checked it against the source documents enough times that the pattern holds, month after month, without exception. That is exactly how I am approaching Brittany now. Not with suspicion, not with a magnifying glass over every purchase, but with patient, quiet attention, watching whether the pattern holds over time, the way it should have held all along. I think a lot of people, hearing this story, might expect me to say that I check her spending now, that I asked Daniel to send me screenshots of their accounts. That I've turned into the kind of mother-in-law who hovers and audits and never lets an old wound fully close. I want to be honest that I considered that, in the rawest, angriest days right after I found that charge. But I decided against it, deliberately, because a relationship built on permanent surveillance isn't actually a rebuilt relationship at all, it's just a longer, slower version of the same broken dynamic, except now everyone knows the cameras are running. Real trust has to include risk. It has to include the possibility of being wrong again, or it isn't trust, it's just a different kind of control. And I did not go through all of this just to trade one form of dishonesty for a colder, more clinical version of watching my daughter-in-law's every move. But 2 nights ago, Brittany called just to talk, no update, no agenda, and we ended up on the phone for almost an hour, longer than we'd talked, just the two of us, and longer than I could remember. She told me about a hard day at work, about Mason's new obsession with a cartoon about talking trains that she said she now has memorized against her will, about a recipe she wanted to try for Sunday dinner, and whether I thought Daniel would actually eat something with that many vegetables in it, knowing my son the way I do. It felt, for those long stretches of the conversation, almost like it used to, before any of this happened, easy and warm and unremarkable in the best possible way. And then, near the end, she got quiet for a moment, and said something that surprised me. "Eleanor, I used to think of you as Daniel's mom, someone I was supposed to be nice to for his sake. Because that's what a good wife does, she plays nice with the mother-in-law. I don't think of you that way anymore. I think I finally understand why he always said you were the strongest person he knew, and I think, honestly, some part of me is grateful you didn't just let this go quietly, even though it was the hardest thing I've ever gone through, because I don't know if I would have actually changed if you had. I did not cry on that call, I told you. I don't cry easily, but I sat in this kitchen and felt something loosen in my chest that had been tight for 3 weeks straight, and not I hadn't even fully realized was still there until it wasn't anymore. I do not regret one single thing I did. I do not regret letting that vacation happen, letting the money get spent, letting them fly out with no idea what waited the moment they landed. I do not regret the 3 hours I let pass before calling Daniel back, or disputing that charge, or removing Brittany from my card, or laying those 40 highlighted pages down and making her look at every line. A woman my age, who worked 31 years to build the small, steady, honest life I have, does not owe anyone the right to take advantage of her quietly and get away with it just because family is supposed to forgive easily. Family is supposed to be honest first. Forgiveness comes after, and it has to be earned, same as trust. But I also don't regret choosing, in the end, not to burn the whole thing to the ground. I didn't press charges. I didn't cut Brittany out of my grandchildren's lives. I didn't turn Daniel's marriage into a war he had to pick a side in. I found the space between letting myself be walked over and becoming someone who destroys everything just to prove a point, and I stood exactly there, on purpose, because that's the only kind of revenge that leaves you with something worth keeping when it's over. A family a little more honest than it used to be. Grandchildren who still get to grow up with 2 parents who love them, and a grandmother teaching them, without ever saying it out loud, what it looks like to stand your ground with grace. Ava and Mason came over for cookies again yesterday. Mason still insists on those dinosaur boots. Ava beat me at that card game twice, and this time I really wasn't letting her win, because that little girl is getting sharper every single week, and I could not be prouder of her if I tried. That is my story, exactly as it happened, exactly as it is still happening, because the trust, the healing, the slow rebuilding, that part isn't finished yet. If you made it this far with me, thank you for sitting with an old woman and her kitchen table full of highlighted bank statements. Tell me where you're watching from, comment your city below, I read every single one. And if you love your grandma, if she has ever quietly fought a battle for your family that you never even knew about, do me one more favor. Hit that like button, subscribe if you haven't already, and share this with a friend who needs to hear it today.